The official records list Elijah Ward's landing zone as an estimated 2 kilometers east of Objective Lantern. The phrasing appears repeatedly in the archival notes of airborne operations in Normandy, an understated acknowledgement of a widespread problem. During the Second World War, paratrooper drops were frequently scattered by wind shifts, anti-aircraft fire, and hurried navigation in hostile airspace. Ward's misdrop was not unique. What came after it was, he fell through a ceiling of low clouds at approximately 0210 hours. Below him, the forest carried no visible movement, no lanterns, no patrol routes, no tracer fire, just a textured darkness that swallowed the outlines of trees. His parachute opened cleanly, and he drifted without incident through a corridor of still air. The absence of turbulence, noted in his later statements, struck him as unusual for the region. Normandy's inland forests typically carried pockets of gust and coastal drafts, even at night. Yet Ward descended as if the entire landscape had exhaled once and then refused to breathe again. Upon landing, he conducted the standard checks: canopy, equipment, bearings. His boots touched soil that felt damp but undisturbed. The ground carried no tracks, not from wildlife, not from German patrols, not from other paratroopers. The forest around him emitted an acoustic profile that, while subtle, deviated sharply from wartime expectations. The normal auditory signatures, owls, insects, distant rustling, were absent. Even the wind moved differently, threading through branches without producing the layered whisper common in European woodland. Surviving reconnaissance reports from other airborne missions note that wildlife silence often served as an early indicator of human presence or mechanical intrusion. Birds ceased their calls when engines, boots, or unfamiliar vibrations entered their territory. Ward understood this principle. It was part of his training as a long-range marksman. But here, the quiet preceded him. The forest was already muted when he arrived, as though it had been intentionally conditioned to remain still. He moved with disciplined caution, advancing in incremental steps, pausing to test the air and listen. No counter-movement followed. No shift of brush. No branch adjusting underweight. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted, a slow pressure at the back of the neck, the sort often reported by soldiers long before any visual confirmation. About 20 minutes into his advance, Ward noticed an anomaly in the terrain, a faint indentation pattern across the forest floor. It did not resemble tracks or the markings of recent passage. Instead, it appeared as if something had compressed the soil lightly and uniformly, creating a rhythm too consistent for natural occurrence. He later described it as the kind of pattern you'd see when someone tries to erase their own footprints. The silence deepened as he approached an incline overlooking a narrow ravine. Here he halted, analyzing the geometry of the slope, the density of surrounding foliage, and the visibility lines available to any observer positioned above or below. The scene carried the unmistakable architecture of a kill zone, but one arranged with excessive precision. The placement of rocks and branches suggested deliberate manipulation, not the incidental scattering produced by weather. Then, without warning, a single stone detached from the upper ridge. It rolled downhill in a clean, uninterrupted line, striking other stones with dull, measured impacts. Ward tracked its movement from origin to rest, and found no figure, no branch motion, no fragment of displaced soil indicating what had triggered it. The forest's stillness remained undisturbed, as though the event had occurred outside the boundaries of natural behavior. Ward lowered himself behind a tree trunk, steadying his breath. His conclusion, recorded later in his debriefing, was concise and unwavering. "They know I'm here," he whispered into the dark. Elijah Ward advanced downslope from the point where the unexplained stone had rolled. The silence remained intact, behaving less like an absence of sound and more like an imposed condition. The soil at the base of the ridge grew softer, darkened by moisture that had accumulated in patches where the forest canopy thinned. Such terrain proved useful for determining recent passage. Water retention affected the definition of impressions, allowing trained observers to estimate age within a narrow margin. Ward moved steadily but cautiously, placing each step with deliberate weight distribution to prevent deep prints that could be followed easily. He avoided soft pockets when possible, and crossed firmer ground where impressions would be faint. This practice aligned with common airborne and reconnaissance protocol of the period, minimizing trace while maximizing observational advantage. Approximately 30 meters into the lowland, he detected the first anomaly. A boot print, clear, recent, centered in a patch of mud he had consciously avoided moments earlier. Its edges retained sharp definition, indicating it had been made within minutes, not hours. Moisture had not yet pooled into its recesses, nor had the surrounding soil begun to slump inward. The print did not belong to the forest's natural inhabitants. Its structure reflected human footwear with standardized tread. He knelt beside it, noting the depth and angle. It suggested a controlled stride, neither hurried nor hesitant. The direction led precisely along his own route, mirroring his path with near-exact alignment. Ward examined the surrounding area for secondary marks, scuffs, slips, or displacements, but found none. The intruder had stepped only where Ward had stepped or where he had chosen not to. Continuing forward, he identified additional prints. Each appeared at intervals consistent with the pace of an individual tracking him. Yet the forest produced no corresponding sounds, no snapping twigs, no brush compression, no displaced foliage. The creation of the prints appeared dissociated from the expected acoustic signatures of movement, a detail that would later stand out in his official account. Ward conducted a comparative assessment, measuring the width and length of one impression using a method common among infantry and airborne troops. The tread pattern, defined by a double-arch segmentation and angled heel, matched U.S. issue boots. He confirmed this with a second print farther ahead, whose shape replicated not only his equipment but his weight distribution. The possibility that another American paratrooper had landed nearby was plausible in general terms, but inconsistent with the timing. No other descent had been recorded in his vicinity, and the precise shadowing of his route suggested intentional mimicry. The broader implication developed gradually as he advanced. Someone or something was generating prints that matched his own equipment, stride, and route with exacting precision, yet always moments after he passed. The phenomenon resembled an early form of psychological interference, a tactic not extensively documented during the Normandy campaign, but theoretically sound. By duplicating a soldier's movements, an enemy could destabilize his sense of orientation, obscure true positions, and induce hesitation. As Ward proceeded, the pattern grew more deliberate. At one junction where he had paused briefly to examine a broken branch, he found a second footprint overlaying the faint trace of his own. The overlay was too clean, too symmetrical, to have occurred naturally. It was applied with intention, as if to demonstrate awareness of his actions in real time. Fog drifted in from the west, settling low against the ground and creating a muted, monochrome environment. Through it, Ward advanced toward a narrow clearing. There he halted, raising his rifle to check the chamber. The metallic click of the bolt carried sharply in the quiet. A moment later, from somewhere beyond the fog, another bolt answered, a precise, mirrored click, matched to his rhythm as though reflecting it back to him. When the matched rifle bolt echo faded into the fog, Elijah Ward shifted his attention back to the terrain. The forest floor narrowed into a slanted corridor of exposed shale, where the soil had eroded into a long band of loose gravel descending toward a shallow basin. The stones varied in size, some no larger than seeds, others angular fragments that still held the memory of the ridge they had once belonged to. Their arrangement showed signs of controlled disturbance. While erosion could form such a slope naturally, the clean edges and uncluttered path suggested maintenance. Ward approached with measured steps. Each footfall displaced stones that produced abrupt, metallic clatter, sharper than the subdued forest air should have carried. The gravel did not move quietly. It behaved almost like an instrument awaiting deliberate activation. He knelt again, lifting a small handful and letting them fall. The stones struck one another with a brittle series of clicks, and the sound projected outward in a short, fast burst. The burst came back twice. Ward froze, analyzing the sequence. He had generated one sound. The terrain had answered with two distinct returns. The first belonged to natural acoustics, an expected reflection from a slope or outcropping. But the second was delayed by a fraction inconsistent with the landscape he had observed so far. Echo returns in uneven terrain generally follow predictable rules. Harder surfaces produce sharper reflections. Forest density softens reverberation, and distance elongates decay. Here, the second echo was neither softened nor elongated. It arrived intact, as if shaped by a surface designed specifically to reflect. He repeated the test, dropping another small cluster of gravel. Again, 2 returns. The second possessed a more compressed timbre, almost metallic. Ward studied the ridge line above him. Trees grew thickly in several layers, branches overlapping in ways that should have diffused any artificial structure. Nothing visible explained the second echo's clarity. Loose gravel slopes had been used historically as primitive alarm systems, natural tripwires that required no rope, wire, or tool. Shifting stones could signal movement, allowing those positioned higher on the slope to track intruders by sound alone. Ward recognized the intent. The Germans had not merely adapted the terrain, they had engineered it to listen. He moved slowly along the edge of the slope, testing at different angles. Subtle variations emerged. At one point near a cluster of exposed roots, the gravel produced only a single return. At another, near a gap between 2 boulders, the second echo strengthened, behaving almost like a tuned response. The placement suggested that whoever designed the system had spent significant time aligning surfaces to maximize acoustic detection. Wind cut across the clearing, stripping leaves from branches and scattering them across the gravel. Their contact generated faint rustles, distinct from the sharper stone impacts. Ward noted how effectively the German system separated signal from noise. Leaves produced soft, organic sounds. Gravel produced clean, mechanical ones. A listener on the ridge would know instantly which was which. To test the system further, Ward tossed a larger stone downslope. It struck the gravel with a louder impact. The first echo returned normally. The second followed, again too precise for natural terrain. This time, however, its direction of origin registered clearly. It came not from his left or right, nor from a distant slope. It came from above the ridge line. Ward lowered his hand, holding his breath to ensure he had not misjudged. The ridge rose steeply, nearly impossible for a reflective surface to exist at that height without visual evidence. The trees stood in continuous rows. No rock outcropping projected outward at the required angle. Yet the echo had returned from a position that should have been silent. Gravel clicked again beneath his boot as he shifted. The sound traveled upward, as if reporting on his location. Ward looked toward the ridge crest, now shrouded in a thin veil of drifting fog. One of the echoes had come from a place no echo should exist. Elijah Ward remained at the base of the gravel slope until the air steadied and the forest resumed its controlled stillness. He moved uphill with deliberate care, using the shadows of fir trunks as intermittent cover. The terrain narrowed into a steep corridor framed by ridgelines that twisted in irregular, almost geometric forms. Their shapes appeared natural at first glance, yet each section offered vantage points that combined elevation with concealment. Ward recognized such locations immediately. They reflected the terrain logic historically favored by sharpshooters who relied on height, shade, and predictable lanes of movement below. From a shallow depression in the ground, a natural bowl formed by erosion, he began his survey. The position allowed modest visibility while lowering his silhouette against the skyline. He sketched mental outlines the way 19th-century topographers once mapped frontier wilderness, tracing ridgelines by angle, calculating slope gradients, and assessing how sound traveled through broken timber and stone. Ward listened first. The forest's acoustics revealed more than its appearance. Wind funneled between ridges at uneven intervals, producing narrow corridors of amplified noise and broad shelves of near silence. A rifle shot from any elevated angle would exploit these natural highways of sound, mask its origin, or exaggerate its distance. The Fallshirmjager cell had positioned itself within a landscape that acted as an extension of their rifles. He tested the theory. Lifting a small stone, he struck it lightly against a fallen branch. The sound traveled upward and fractured in 2 distinct directions, one toward a concave ridge face, the other dispersing along a narrow timber line. Both returns arrived intact. He cataloged them. First reflection north by northwest, second east by southeast. These angles, though subtle, indicated elevated positions where marksmen could operate without exposing glints of metal or shifts of movement. Ward followed the reflections with his eyes, reconstructing what the Germans had built. It was not a random spread of sharpshooters. It was a structured web, firing points arranged so each nest covered another's blind spots, while also monitoring the valley. No single marksman dominated the terrain. Instead, the angles formed a coordinated grid of lethal oversight. Anyone moving through the forest below would be mapped by sound before they were seen. Testing again, Ward tapped another stone, this time against the rim of his canteen. The sharper tone produced a cleaner return. 3 echoes answered. One from a ridge spur 40 meters above him, one from a narrow chute of trees to the south, and one from a stone shelf partially concealed behind a line of undergrowth. None were visible. All were mathematically positioned. He repeated the test from a slightly different angle. This time, 6 distinct returns formed a sequence. Their spacing lacked uniformity, yet each fell within a logical arc consistent with deliberate placement. The Germans appeared to have carved small cavities into snow-packed ridges and supported firing hides with timber braces, using natural curves to direct sound away from their own positions while collecting the noise produced below. Ward concluded that at least 6 firing points existed, precise, elevated, and interconnected. Their triangulated arcs showed coverage of the entire basin, the gravel slope, and even the narrow route leading toward the Allied drop zone. The ridge was not simply a defensive structure. It was a listening device, shaped over days, possibly weeks. He made one final test. Using a wet, gloved fingertip, he produced a short, controlled snap near the bark of a downed tree. The sound carried a minimal signature, intended to reveal only the nearest reflective surface. 7 echoes returned. The 7th did not come from ahead, above, or along the ridgelines he had already mapped. It came from behind him, a location he had confirmed empty less than an hour earlier. Elijah Ward did not move for several minutes after the 7th echo returned from behind him. Stillness was the only tool that could clarify what senses alone could not. The forest, suspended in its colorless quiet, seemed to wait with him. Snow dust drifted from upper branches, landing softly enough to leave no sound signature at all, a contrast that helped him distinguish natural silence from engineered absence. He shifted only when the wind changed direction. With measured slowness, he eased his rifle forward, laying the barrel across a fallen limb that acted as a brace. The weapon was not meant for firing. It was an instrument now, its hollow steel channel capable of creating the clean, minimal tone he needed to begin his first deliberate silence test. Ward placed 3 pieces of gravel into his gloved palm. The stones were carefully selected for uniform size, ensuring that any acoustic variation came from the environment rather than the material. He tapped one gently against the rifle barrel. The sound was small, barely more than a metallic pinprick, but it carried just enough to reveal the forest's response. The first echo returned with predictable behavior, a soft bounce from the ridge face he had previously identified. The delay matched his earlier calculations. A second followed, thinner and higher, tracking along a tree line whose curvature he had already mapped. Both were genuine, terrain reflections consistent with known positions. He repeated the tap. Again, 2 echoes. No anomalies. Ward then executed the next phase, silence measurement. This was a technique older than modern acoustics, used by trackers who learned to read not only what made noise, but what avoided it. He held the rifle barrel suspended with both hands and created no sound at all. Instead, he listened for the faint distortions produced when wind encountered hollow cavities, voids where human-made structures or concealed hides disrupted natural airflow. The forest answered slowly. Air funneled through a notch in the ridge, vibrating in a narrow band. Below it, 2 separate pockets of compressed space produced faint pulses, a near silence rather than an echo. The absence of sound confirmed 2 additional nests. Their concealment was effective, but their negative acoustic imprint remained detectable. He repeated this process for nearly an hour. Motion was minimal, measured in millimeters. Remaining unseen required distributing weight evenly so snow would not compress. Human observers relied on sudden changes. Ward offered none. By the end of his grid, he had verified 6 distinct nests, each occupying a different elevation band. The Germans had assembled them with deliberate spacing that mirrored the forest's natural geometry. No two positions created overlapping echoes. This minimized detection and maximized coverage. Ward began the final validation, what he called the anomaly test. He tapped the rifle barrel once more, using the faintest possible touch. It produced a whisper of metal. Two expected echoes returned with perfect alignment. Then a third arrived. This third echo carried none of the imperfections terrain usually imposed. It had no decay, no distortion, and no deviation in timing. It was too precise, too clean, a sound without the signature of distance. Ward froze. The gravel tap had been small enough that even a trained sniper would struggle to reproduce it exactly, especially without clear line of sight. He tested again. Another controlled tap. Again, the third echo returned. Identical. Perfectly matched, as if the forest itself had responded with a flawless imitation. Only one explanation remained. The Germans were not merely listening. They were mimicking. Ward exhaled slowly. The third echo came a final time, this time with a faint metallic resonance, almost deliberate in its clarity. "Someone is repeating me," he whispered. Exactly. Elijah Ward approached the ridge with the same caution he had applied to all forest elevations since his arrival. The cold pressed against his uniform, and frost crystallized along the fallen branches, sharp as splintered glass. Every snap of a twig, every subtle crunch of snow underfoot was magnified in the unbroken quiet. He had learned to measure time by the echoes alone. Now, it was time to investigate the anomalies identified in his first grid. The first nest he encountered was an unremarkable depression beneath a pine cluster. From a distance, it appeared abandoned. Branches partially obscured the hollow, and there was no evidence of recent movement. Ward crouched behind a fallen log, scanning methodically. His eyes traced the subtle undulations in the snow, the faint depressions that betrayed footprints older than a day. Nothing shifted. Nothing moved. Yet, the silence seemed curated, deliberately muted. As he inched closer, Elijah noticed an unusual glint beneath the root tangle. Kneeling, he brushed aside frost-coated needles. Beneath them lay a slender wire, almost invisible against the dark soil. Following its course with gloved fingers, he saw that it led across the forest floor, disappearing under another root mound. At the center of this wire rested a small, bell-like device, barely larger than his thumb. A primitive tripwire acoustic trap. Mechanical, minimal, precise. Elijah examined the construction with the same meticulous detachment he applied to his earlier echo studies. The bell was set to chime with the slightest movement along the wire, a deceptively simple arrangement. Any soldier or scout stepping on the trigger would alert the nest occupant, or, in this case, the German snipers observing from a distance. Its placement among roots ensured that no footstep directly above it would reveal its presence. Here, technology and camouflage converged in a pre-modern iteration of battlefield misdirection. Ward realized immediately that this was not a firing position. There was no concealment for a sniper's body, no support for a rifle, no scope, no bedding for extended occupation. This was a decoy, an acoustic lure designed to provoke a reaction, to test his ability to distinguish real threats from false ones. He traced the wire with his eyes and fingers. The path extended farther than expected, curving naturally with the terrain, but systematically laid to funnel approaching troops. Following the hidden course, he saw 5 more identical setups, each placed to imitate a potential nest. The Germans had engineered an array of false positions, an acoustic maze meant to mislead any reconnaissance effort. Their ingenuity lay in subtlety. An advancing unit could easily miscount or misinterpret the forest, exposing themselves to the actual nests. Ward crouched silently, inhaling the frigid air, eyes scanning for shadows, for reflections, for movement. Then, without warning, the first bell rang, a clean metallic tone that sliced through the stillness. He had not touched the wire. His gaze darted along the branches, the root tangles, the snow-covered ridges. Nothing had moved. Yet the signal sounded, proof that the Germans were observing, perhaps even manipulating, the acoustic environment remotely, or at the very least, the forest itself had been prepared to respond to the smallest disturbance. The sound sent a ripple of caution through him, confirming the sophistication of enemy engineering. The bell's chime was more than a warning. It was a message. Each decoy nest was a node in a deliberately crafted network of misdirection, designed to test, mislead, and corral troops without direct engagement. The forest, previously a passive backdrop, had become an active participant in warfare, a participant trained to communicate through sound. Ward straightened, his mind already calculating next steps. The presence of 5 additional decoys implied a systematic pattern. If one could be set up in isolation, the cell could extend this technique throughout the sector. It was subtle, silent, and lethal in its psychological effect. He whispered to himself, careful to avoid sound. They're learning faster than we thought. And then, as if to punctuate the warning, a distant, solitary bell chimed. Ward had never touched the wire. The forest had spoken without being touched. Elijah understood that his hunt for the snipers would require not only marksmanship and observation, but a mastery of silence itself. Elijah Ward settled into a narrow depression along the ridge, the damp soil pressing cold against his palms. The forest around him was draped in pre-dawn stillness, the kind that felt like a held breath. The bells from the decoy nests still lingered in his mind, mechanical proof that the Germans were alert to even the faintest disturbance. He had survived the ghost nests, but the problem remained. How to neutralize these unseen threats without exposing himself. He examined the forest floor, noting the scattering of small stones and gravel along the incline. A subtle idea began to take shape. Each rock, when dropped with care, produced a tiny acoustic signature, a sound that would travel along ridges and hollows differently depending on its placement. If he could manipulate timing, weight, and placement, perhaps he could simulate movement, create the illusion of presence where he was not. The Germans, he realized, had trained themselves to trust echoes, to respond reflexively to the faintest disturbance. That instinct could become his tool. Ward selected a small, flat stone. He measured the time it took to slide it down the slope, observing the delay before it struck a root or hidden log. He repeated the test several times, adjusting the angle, the force, the starting point. Each minor alteration produced a different return of sound, bouncing off ridges and hollow trunks, weaving a network of auditory clues. His mind recorded the patterns like a map. 1 stone, 3 echoes, 2 stones, staggered returns, suggesting movement along a line. He had discovered the rudiments of a new method, a precision tool forged from nature itself. Hours passed in careful experimentation. The cold air crystallized around his breath, frost forming on his coat, yet Elijah remained patient, noting the subtleties of each impact. He recognized the Germans' listening habits in the echoes, imagining their mental triangulations as they waited for the smallest hint of motion. He was not merely hiding from them anymore. He was beginning to manipulate their perception. Finally, Ward was ready to test the decoy. Selecting a sequence of stones, he dropped them in staggered intervals along the ridge. The impacts echoed crisply, bouncing through valleys, magnified by hollow trunks, distorted by ridges. Seconds later, rifle reports cracked from the direction of a false impact. He ducked instinctively, noting that the Germans had fired at a place he had never touched. The echoes had done their work. His phantom movement had drawn real fire. Heart rate steady, Elijah analyzed the firing angles, tracing lines back to their origin. One shot had struck a branch too low. Its trajectory intersected the ridge near a previously silent nest. The Germans had revealed the location themselves. His gravel decoy had not only misled but also exposed a true position, one they had deliberately kept silent to deceive his unit. The efficacy of the method was undeniable. Controlled sound could manipulate even the most disciplined enemy snipers. He continued the experiment over several trials, refining the timing, spacing, and force of each gravel drop. Each successful test deepened his understanding of acoustic deception. Each misstep offered insight into the enemy's reactions. By dawn, Ward had not only refined a practical method for his own survival, but had weaponized the forest itself. Loose gravel, ordinary stones, and careful timing. A soldier's improvisation had become an instrument of war. Ward allowed himself a brief moment to note the implications. The forest was no longer just terrain. It was an active participant, a conduit for deception. He packed his remaining stones, eyes scanning the ridges for any movement. any hint of the newly revealed nest. Somewhere above him, the Germans were regrouping, and now they were aware that he had learned to turn their own acoustic vigilance against them. The next echo was not one he created. A single rifle shot rang out, striking the ridge where no man had moved. The Germans had fired at a position he had never occupied, confirming the efficacy of his newly born technique. Through a simple sequence of stone drops, Elijah had transformed silence into a weapon, and the forest itself now whispered the paths of death for those who underestimated it. Snow clung to the pine branches like ash from an extinguished fire, muting the forest and swallowing every footstep Elijah Ward made as he moved along the western ridge. The German's reaction to his gravel decoy still echoed faintly in his memory. Rifle cracks fired at empty space, and it confirmed what he already suspected. They were not lone marksmen working in isolation. There was structure here, coordination, an entire acoustic web laid across the forest. He needed to find its full shape before the U.S. patrol scheduled for the morning walked into it. The first two nests he identified through rifling residue on bark, a faint, gray smear where a barrel had rested. The placement was classic, facing a narrow draw, allowing any movement below to be funneled into a clean line of fire. Nearby, he found the second, a low hollow between two roots, reinforced with a scraped-out depression that provided both cover and a natural firing arc. Their angles overlapped perfectly. That alone told Elijah the truth. This was not opportunistic positioning. This was a cage being built intentionally. He moved deeper. Every nest he discovered used the terrain like parts of a machine. Markers only a trained eye could see appeared one after another. Clipped branches where scopes needed a cleared sight line. Faint snow displacement where elbows had rested, soil scraped clean by the recoil of a rifle. Each sign told a piece of a larger story. They were preparing to fire in tandem. By the time he found the sixth nest, he could already sketch the geometry of the kill zone. For rifles would fire from the northern rise, for more from the ridge parallel to it, and the remaining nests were staggered in precise intervals to bleed into one another's firing arcs. Elijah's breath formed a low cloud as he surveyed the angles. 14 positions, no blind spots. A closed circle ambush. He crouched beside the seventh nest, noting the differences between this and the decoys he'd passed earlier. These weren't made to lure, they were made to kill. Real nests required structural support, root cradles, belly depressions, camouflaged firing grooves. These were all present and consistent. This was a trained cell, likely Fallshirmjager sharpshooters, relying on distributed triangulation rather than single-point engagement. Once they fired, not a man in the open would survive 10 seconds. Ward mapped each location mentally, forming a lattice of lines, angles, and estimated fields of fire. The network had been built with ruthless precision. These snipers weren't hunting him. They were waiting, patient, disciplined, silent. The realization settled heavily in his chest. He found the 12th and 13th nests in rapid succession, both positioned to catch stragglers or runners. The 14th, however, took him nearly half an hour. It was placed higher, overlooking the entire valley. Its position told him everything. This was the command rifle, the one meant to anchor the engagement. A single shot from here would trigger the others, and then chaos would swallow anyone trapped inside the kill zone. He scanned the valley floor below, imagining the patrol route. He traced the path the U.S. squad would follow, straight into the overlapping arcs. 14 shadows in the pines waiting to ignite. He checked his watch. 2 hours and 43 minutes until the patrol passed through. The sniper cell wasn't waiting for him. They were waiting for them. And unless Ward found a way to break the cage before sunrise, the forest would become a slaughterhouse. The frost-laden undergrowth cracked beneath Elijah Ward's boots as he pushed forward, the first hints of morning light brushing the black and white forest in muted shades. He could hear the distant cadence of the regiment's boots on frozen earth, measured, unaware of the lattice of death waiting ahead. Time was a tight line, every second counted. Ward reached the forward detachment, officers leaning over hastily unfurled maps and consulting compasses, the discipline of routine clashing with his urgency. Their faces were pale against the mist, their skepticism palpable. "Private Ward," the commanding lieutenant said, "we are on schedule. What evidence do you have that we are not merely imagining danger?" Elijah's eyes swept over the ridges and dips he had meticulously surveyed. He spoke evenly, methodically, as though reading from a classified report. 14 confirmed nests, each aligned with the patrol's expected route. Overlapping fields of fire. Rifles positioned to maximize crossfire. Calculations based on terrain acoustics and visual triangulation. The officers exchanged glances. One frowned, tapping a pencil against the frost-hardened map. Acoustic triangulation? He asked. That's not a standard verification method. We cannot halt the march on intuition. Elijah clenched his jaw. He understood their hesitation. To a conventional mind, sound without sight was speculation. Yet every step he had taken, every echo measured with a single stone or the gravel he had tested, had confirmed the network. He exhaled, the air fogging before him, and knelt to the forest floor. From his coat pocket he retrieved a small, smooth stone, worn and unassuming. "I'll make the echoes talk," he said, voice low but clear. He placed the stone carefully atop a slight incline in the underbrush, then tapped it with a controlled, deliberate rhythm. The sound ricocheted through the valley, subtle yet precise, carrying across ridges and hollows. From the east, a faint but unmistakable response, a percussive echo that did not match his initial strike. Another followed, and then a third. Each return sound was delayed, distinct, marking the hidden nests he had mapped hours before. Officers leaned closer, disbelief etched on their faces. The regiment's route was under siege, and here was the evidence. Audible, measurable, undeniable. One officer whispered, almost to himself, It follows your rhythm." Another scribbled notes, checking angles against the map. The forest held its breath, muffled frost absorbing all sound except for Elijah's stone tapping and the returning echoes. Ward's mind raced. He could not afford hesitation. There, he pointed toward a low ridge. The echoes come from positions designed to appear empty. See how they respond. 14 nests. Every single one calculated for crossfire. Stop the patrol. Now. The lieutenant remained silent, eyes narrowing, lips pursed. Ward's hand rose, stone poised between thumb and forefinger, catching the morning light. A single ray reflected off its smooth surface, glinting like a signal. This was no longer theory. This was proof, tactile and auditory, a demonstration the officers could not ignore. From behind the trees, the regiment's boots drew nearer. Frost crunched under the advancing patrol. Ward felt the cold bite at his face, but his mind remained sharp. Every echo, every sound, every hidden angle pressed him forward. He inhaled deeply and held the stone aloft. The forest was silent in anticipation, waiting for the signal that would confirm the truth of the 14 nests, waiting for the echoes to speak as he promised. The morning air remained crisp, the frost clinging to pine needles like brittle glass, muting even the softest footfalls. Elijah Ward stood at the edge of the clearing, gravel gathered in a small pouch at his side. Around him, the officers arranged themselves in careful semicircles, maps unrolled on low logs and rough-cut stones, their eyes wary and expectant. Silence reigned, a tension that weighed heavily, as though the forest itself anticipated what was about to occur. Elijah's movements were deliberate. He selected a stone roughly the size of a walnut, worn smooth by repeated handling. Placing it atop a subtle incline in the forest floor, he tapped it once with the side of his boot, producing a short, clear note. The sound traveled, sharp and precise, into the hollow valleys and ridges he had painstakingly mapped over the past days. He waited, eyes scanning the frost-crusted forest, ears attuned to the faintest return. The first echo came, subtle but unmistakable. Its origin pointed toward a low ridge, partially hidden by dense firs, a nest he had already marked in his mental survey. A second echo followed seconds later, slightly delayed, emanating from a hollowed root system at the base of a knoll. One by one, the echoes returned, each distinct, each marking a separate concealed firing position. The officers leaned closer, pencils poised, tracing lines on their maps as if the forest itself were speaking through Elijah's demonstration. By the time the eighth echo resonated, murmurs rippled among the observers. Maps were annotated, lines of sight drawn, circles denoting confirmed positions. Frost-laden breath formed small clouds in the cold air, mingling with the tension of disbelief. Every echo confirmed what Elijah had long suspected. The sniper cell was a coordinated network, 14 firing positions calculated to cover every likely route of movement for the advancing U.S. patrol. Elijah moved systematically from one prepared slope of gravel to another, tapping each with measured rhythm, ensuring sufficient spacing between strikes so that the officers could differentiate the origin of each return. The echoes crossed and overlapped, yet his trained ear distinguished each path, revealing the deliberate geometry of the trap. Historical field mapping techniques, learned through archival reports and prior reconnaissance experience, guided his hand. This was reconnaissance without sight, acoustic cartography in its most rudimentary and effective form. As the 14th echo returned, a cold realization passed through the group. The invisible web of snipers was now visible through sound alone. Officers nodded in restrained acknowledgement, their skepticism replaced by urgency. Plans began forming. Preliminary calculations for counterfire, plotting approach routes, and adjusting patrol formations based on the acoustic data Elijah had extracted. The quiet, monochrome forest became a living blueprint of tactical danger. Then it happened. A 15th echo returned, perfectly timed after the last stone strike, yet it did not match any tap he had made. It was cleaner, sharper, almost metallic, a resonance that had no origin in his controlled demonstration. The officers froze, glancing at one another. Maps lay untouched in their hands. Pencils hovered midair. Elijah's voice cut the tension, low and measured. "That one wasn't mine," he said quietly, eyes scanning the shadowed ridges above. There was an awareness now, something beyond the 14 known nests. A new variable, one engineered to deceive, to manipulate, and potentially to kill. The metallic clarity of the echo lingered in the frozen air, a silent warning that the forest held more than just 14 hidden shooters. The demonstration ended, but the lesson had been delivered. Each echo had confirmed a nest, revealed a field of fire, and transformed skepticism into strategic understanding. Yet the 15th sound, the unnatural, alien echo, remained unanswered, a new enigma threading through the meticulously mapped forest. The trap, they now realized, had a hidden complexity they had yet to fully comprehend. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the Vosges tree line, blurring the edges of fallen branches and frost-encrusted stumps. Elijah Ward crouched low behind a mossy boulder, rifle resting across his knees, senses attuned to the faintest vibrations in the air. The 15th echo from yesterday's demonstration still reverberated in his mind, clean, metallic, impossibly precise. It had originated somewhere the terrain should not have allowed, an anomaly in the otherwise organic acoustic field. Today, he intended to locate its source. He moved cautiously along a narrow ridge, boots pressing softly against frost-hardened soil. Each step produced a negligible crunch, yet the slope seemed unnaturally responsive. Elijah had brought small stones, testing brief taps at strategic intervals. The echoes returned, and with meticulous attention, he compared the timing, amplitude, and pitch. One return deviated from natural parameters, sharper, higher, with a resonance that carried farther than any organic hollow or cavity could. Elijah's analytical mind considered the possibilities. Metal, he muttered under his breath. The Germans, resourceful and methodical, had likely embedded a reflective surface, carefully angled to return amplified sound toward approaching troops. A primitive acoustic trap, a plate or sheet suspended or affixed in a hidden position, could mislead any observer relying solely on auditory cues. The thought aligned with the unusual precision of the 15th echo. Crawling closer, he noted subtle signs in the frost. A glint from a thin sheet of metal partially camouflaged beneath pine needles, the faint indentation where supports had been driven into the soil, and a barely perceptible anchor wire stretching into a shadowed copse. The plate's orientation suggested it could reflect the smallest gravel disturbance and, in turn, signal the 14 sniper nests scattered across the ridge. The realization struck him. The unnatural echo was not an accident. It was a trigger. Elijah examined the surrounding slope with a cold, calculated eye. Any attempt to strike the plate would produce an immediate, amplified signal. That signal would carry through the prearranged acoustic pathways, guiding riflemen to fire along predetermined lines. The consequences were stark. Destroying the plate would prevent it from luring attention falsely, but simultaneously, the action would reveal the positions of all 14 nests in one instantaneous signal. The trap was elegant, mechanical, and lethal. He ran his gloved hand along the metal surface, noting its thickness and sheen under frost. The resonance confirmed his earlier analysis. This was not a natural artifact. It was deliberately designed. Small scratches indicated repeated testing, likely by German engineers familiar with the acoustic properties of the ridge. They had treated the forest itself as a weapon, manipulating echoes to surveil, to mislead, and to control the battlefield without physically exposing themselves. Elijah drew a deep breath, the cold biting at his lungs, and weighed the risk. To neutralize the artificial echo, he would have to climb alone, close enough to strike the plate and disrupt its resonance. Every step upward would be visible from multiple vantage points. Yet hesitation could cost the lives of the regiment moving unknowingly toward the ambush. He glanced down the slope at the trees below, imagining the nested rifles aligned and ready. His decision was immediate. "I'll take it," he said to no one in particular. The forest remained silent, metallic tones of the echo plate faintly vibrating against his palms as if warning him. Elijah secured his gear, testing the small stones in his pouch, planning the timing and trajectory of each sound. One miscalculation, one wrong step, and the coordinated sniper network would activate. Yet inaction guaranteed the same, perhaps with even higher casualties. The observation concluded, he crouched in shadow, calculating angles and rehearsing movements mentally. Every detail mattered: footing, wind, distance, and the precise strike against the plate. The stakes were clear. Destroying the echo device would expose all 14 nests at once. The decision to climb alone was no longer choice. It was necessity. Elijah paused, hand resting on the rough bark of a fir, and whispered to the ridge itself, "Time to make them silent." The ridge seemed to listen, the frost shimmering like glass, as if the forest itself awaited the next act. The ridge breathed under a low-hanging gray sky, the forest shrouded in drifting smoke from distant artillery. Elijah Ward crouched at the base of the final incline, the frost crunching softly under his boots, rifle cradled, and pouch of gravel secured at his side. Every sound he produced was deliberate, each movement calculated against the probability of enemy fire. The 15th echo plate waited above, glinting faintly through the thin veil of mist, a metallic lure for any unsuspecting soldier. Elijah's plan was simple in principle, but deadly in execution. Use the loose gravel decoy to misdirect the German snipers while climbing toward the artificial echo plate. He selected a handful of small stones, timing their release precisely against the natural contours of the slope. Each tap against the gravel sent a controlled, bouncing sound upward, mimicking movement across the ridge. Already, sharp rifle reports crackled from the distance, each bullet striking where the decoy suggested, not where he actually was. The forest became a theater of sound and shadow. Smoke drifted past twisted pines, catching in patches of frost that refracted the dull light into a monochrome haze. The echoes of gravel striking the slope overlapped with distant rifle bursts, creating a chaotic pattern the Germans could not disentangle. Elijah's movements were slow but purposeful. Every step was measured, ensuring that his real position remained invisible beneath layers of acoustic deception. He ascended cautiously, glancing down to note the responses from the nests. 14 points of fire had been plotted across the ridge, each a potential death sentence for any soldier exposed. Yet, as the decoy stones fell, the snipers adjusted their aim to phantom movements, revealing the precise locations of all 14 nests. From below, the U.S. regiment, now aware of the threat through Elijah's prior mappings, opened coordinated counterfire. The rifles and light artillery reports cut through the mist in tight, synchronized volleys. The first nests fell with harsh cracks and plumes of smoke. Each successive report confirmed a carefully timed strike. The forest, once a silent accomplice to the German cell, now resounded with controlled chaos. Every nest identified and neutralized in sequence. Elijah's focus remained unwavering. The echo plate above was the final piece. One last stone was poised, timed to coincide with his vertical approach, and he released it. It tumbled downward, ricocheting faintly, triggering rifle fire from positions that should not have been aware of him. The final stretch of the climb brought him to the base of the metallic plate. Fingers numb from frost, he struck it firmly with the butt of his rifle. The metallic echo reverberated once, long and clear, then dissolved into the snowy ridge. The coordinated barrage from below continued, tearing through the remaining nests in a precise, mechanical rhythm. 14 nests were neutralized. Silence reclaimed the forest, broken only by the distant murmur of retreating riflemen and the soft rush of wind through pines. Elijah paused at the top, surveying the aftermath. Smoke drifted past the broken limbs and collapsed nests, the black and white scene stark against the early winter light. He placed a final stone on the ridge, letting it slip from his fingers. It rolled downhill slowly, at first producing no sound. Then one faint, inexplicable echo bounced back from somewhere deep within the forest. Elijah stared at the slope, uncertain whether the echo was his or residual from the enemy's engineering. The forest settled into a muted stillness. The regiment below, finally aware of the full scope of the threat, moved cautiously, but the German cell was gone, eliminated in a single synchronized strike. Elijah's gaze lingered on the ridge, the last echo fading into frost and shadow. His method had succeeded, but the ridge seemed to whisper in memory of what had been, leaving the final sound ambiguous. The loose gravel decoy had ended the cell. The forest retained its silence, yet within that silence lingered a single, faint, unclaimed echo, an enduring testament to a soldier who had listened closer than anyone else.